Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's philosophy, like that of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, was slow to attain world influence. It only came into vogue in the imperialist period, or to be more precise, between the First and Second World War. Certainly during his active life as a writer, Kierkegaard was by no means so neglected a figure in his homeland as Schopenhauer was in Germany before 1848. His first major writings, and the only crucial ones philosophically, the works appearing under pseudonyms, immediately caused a certain stir, nor did his later overt stand against the official Protestant Church lack sensational elements. In the later decades, his spiritual influence even became decisive for a time in Scandinavia. Not only Ibsen's dramatic poem Brand bears witness to this, the influence is also tangible in later Scandinavian literature. However, although translations of his works and individual essays on him had already appeared abroad much earlier, Kierkegaard did not emerge as a leading intellectual force decisively influencing European philosophical reaction until between the two world wars, on the eve of Hitler's seizure of power. This position he has held up to the present day. Speaking in general terms, Kierkegaard's intellectual anticipation of the later development poses no more of a mystery than Schopenhauer's and Nietzsche's. But in order to give a real concretization of it, we would need a knowledge of class relations and class struggles in Denmark during the second quarter of the 19th century, far more intimate than the author of this book possesses. Hence, he would prefer to leave the concrete analysis of this question to others, rather than cast a false light on it through inadequately founded generalizations. We are therefore obliged to treat Kierkegaard from the outset merely as a figure within the European philosophical development, omitting to discuss the concrete social foundations of his mental foreshadowing of much later irrationalist, reactionary tendencies, which were rooted in the Danish society of this age. To be sure, such a mode of treatment does find certain points of connection in Denmark's intellectual development too. Georg Brandes has shown in detail how profound an effect German philosophy and imaginative literature had in Denmark in the first half of the 19th century. 177. That goes for Kierkegaard himself as well. His chief philosophical campaign was directed against Hegel, who represented the philosophically dominant trend in Denmark too at that time, and closely connected with this was Kierkegaard's constant attack on Goethe. His thinking has close points of contact with German Romanticism, Schleiermacher, and Beatter. He traveled to Berlin especially to hear the old Schelling's lectures, and although they were a severe disappointment to him after the violent first flush of enthusiasm, Schelling's new philosophical standpoint and the manner in which he criticized Hegel were not without a far-reaching influence on Kierkegaard's ideas. He also studied in depth the left, opposition to Hegel, especially Feuerbach. Trendelenburg, we shall see, had a crucial influence on his arguments against Hegel. After having elaborated his own standpoint, he read Schopenhauer and held him in high esteem, and so on and so forth. Of course, all this does not sufficiently compensate for the aforestated gap in our account. It merely gives us enough pointers to prevent it from being, even on this score, entirely speculative. Kierkegaard's philosophy, for all the points of contact with Schopenhauer's that we shall demonstrate shortly, is distinct from the latter historically in being closely bound up with the process of Hegelianism's dissolution. During the Restorachine period, it was possible for Schopenhauer to combat Hegelian dialectics as pure nonsense and to counter them with a Kant purified a la Berkeley, a metaphysical and overtly anti-dialectical subjective idealism. At the time of the greatest crisis in idealist dialectical thought, in which there originated the highest form of dialectics completely surmounting its idealist limitations, namely the materialist dialectics of Marx and Engels, Kierkegaard, so as to be able to challenge Hegel in the name of a new, more advanced irrationalism, had to clothe the latter in the guise of an allegedly superior dialectic, the qualitative dialectic. As we shall see, this had to do with the attempt, typical in the history of irrationalism, to thwart the further development of dialectics by inverting the true forward-looking problem of the period, to lead dialectics astray, and to present the inverted proposition in a mythico-mystificatory form as the answer to the concrete question. Kierkegaard, who was a acute, ingenious, and subjectively honest thinker, had an occasional inkling of this complex of ideas. He wrote in his journals in 1836, "Mythology is a hypothetical claim which is transposed into the indicative." 78. The inability of Bourdieu's historians to define Kierkegaard's position in this development also manifests itself in their inability and refusal to comprehend the real meaning of materialist dialectics and their consequent failure to understand the whole process of the dissolution of Hegelianism in the 1840s. 179. Hegel's significance in the history of dialectics lies chiefly in his finding a concept for the most important dialectical conditions and connections of reality. Marx outlined both the greatness and the limitations of Hegelian dialectics precisely when describing his own dialectical method as the direct opposite of Hegel's. The mystification which dialectics undergo in Hegel's hands in no way lessens the fact that he was the first to represent their universal forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious way. With him, they are turned upside down. We need to write them in order to discover the rational core within the mystical shell. 80. This statement also sheds light on the influence which Hegelian dialectics had. Their method, resulting as it did from the Maj or revolutionary crisis in society and the natural sciences at the turn of the 18th to 19th century, became an important organ of the ideological preliminaries to democratic revolution, above all in Germany. Hegel's system, on the other hand, the systematizing of his findings, implied a recognition of the Prussian state of the Restoration period and therefore exerted a conservative, indeed reactionary influence. The non-organic joining of these diverging tendencies could appear tenable only so long as the class conflicts in Germany were undeveloped, or at least remained latent. With the July Revolution, it became inevitable for the dissolution of Hegelianism, the working out of the antithesis between system and method, and thereupon the refashioning of the method itself to begin. This struggle produced an increasingly clear differentiation between the camps or parties in the philosophical domain. After the statements which we have just quoted, Marx characterized this situation as follows. In its rational shape, it is annoying and abhorrent to the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire spokesmen because it includes in the positive understanding of the existing order an understanding of its negation, its inevitable collapse. Well, it comprehends every realized form in the flux of movement, and hence also from its transitory side. It does not let anything impress it, and is essentially critical and revolutionary. It is anything but an accident that, in the dissolution of Hegelianism, one of the chief points of contention was the question of the relation of dialectics to reality. In Hegel's mysticizing of true dialectics, it was his objective idealism, the theory of the identical subject-object, that played the decisive role. As long as the antithesis had not yet collided in life and hence in philosophy, it was possible for such an artificial twilight to continue, an objective reality, posited independent of individual consciousness, but still that of a mysticized mind. The exacerbation of the social conflicts forced philosophy to come down more firmly on one side or the other. What each thinker understood by reality was something that had to be clearly worked out. Is the dialectic, then, the objective motive form of reality itself? And if so, how does consciousness relate to it? As we know, the materialist dialectic answers the latter question to the effect that the subjective dialectic in human knowledge is precisely the reflection of the objective dialectic of reality, and that as a result of the structure of objective reality, this process of reflection likewise proceeds dialectically, not mechanically, the old materialism would have it. That answers the basic question in a clear, unambiguous, and scientific manner. But what was the stance that the bourgeois thinkers adopted to this question? Their class situation made it impossible for them to go on to materialist dialectics and the materialist theory of reflection. When, therefore, the problems of the objectivity of the dialectical categories and their mode of perception receive prominence, they can at best critically dissect Hegel's false synthesis, but are forced either to repudiate dialectics virtually altogether or to reduce them to a purely subjective one. We shall concern ourselves with just one example taken from the copious literature of this period, Adolf Trendelenburg's Hegel critique, not only because this work shows the central problem situation at its clearest, relatively speaking, but also because Trendelenburg, on Kierkegaard's own admission, exerted a strong influence on the Dane. 182 Trendelenburg's critique starts out from an important and well-justified question. Hegelian logic rests, in accordance with the theory of the identical subject-object, on the principle of the logical category's autonomous motion. If we view these as accurately abstracting reflections of the movement of objective reality, as materialist dialectics do, then autonomous motion is given a foothold. But if we approach the examination of this problem from an idealist viewpoint, there then arises the question, one which is fully justified with regard to Hegel: with what right does he introduce motion into logic as a fundamental principle? Trendelenburg challenged this right. He promptly examined the first fundamental transition in Hegel's logic, that from being and non-being to becoming, and arrived at the result that the dialectic, which has been apparently deduced logically, is presupposed without explanation by dialectics that claim to make no hypotheses. He elucidates his idea as follows. Pure being like unto itself is repose. Nothingness, the like unto itself, is similarly repose. Now, does agitated becoming result from the union of two ideas in repose? Nowhere in the preliminary stages is there prefigured the motion without which becoming would be only a being. But if thinking engenders something else from that union, it is evidently adding this other factor to it and tacitly introducing motion in order to bring being and non-being into the flux of becoming. Otherwise, the intrinsically mobile, ever-alive intuition of becoming would never result from being and non-being, these immobile concepts. Becoming could never come about at all from being and non-being were it not preceded by the idea of becoming. Pure being, an admitted abstraction, and nothingness, again an admitted abstraction, cannot all of a sudden give rise to becoming. This, concrete intuition governing life and death. Trendelenburg adds that Hegel investigates motion only in natural philosophy. This, it is plainly evident, reaches to the crucial epistemological question of the Hegelian system and clearly reveals its central idealist weakness. Trendelenburg, however, never managed to get beyond the variation and restatement of this intrinsically justified critique. Certainly, he draws a tie-in to motion in objective reality, but because he again views it idealistically, he cannot discover in the real movement of nature and society the objective prototype of the category's movement in logic, a logically generalized prototype reflected in accordance with consciousness. So while he was able to indicate the central idealist flaw in Hegelian dialectics, it was unrectifiable from Trendelenburg's standpoint. For a solution to the difficulties which Hegel failed to overcome is possible only by obtaining a methodological, theoretical scientific inversion along with the epistemological inversion of dialectics achieved by Marxism, and by locating concretely, in the real categories of objective reality, those prototypes which appear in abstract reflection in logic. In his discussion of Marx's book on the critique of political economy, Engels raises the question of whether the correct methodological treatment of these problems is historical or logical. Like Marx, he decides in favor of the latter and now defines its essence in an account which casts much light on our present problem. The logical mode of treatment was therefore the only opposite one. But this is none other, in fact, than the historical mode, only devoid of the historical form and disruptive contingencies. The train of thought must start where this history starts, and its further progress will be nothing but the mirror image in an abstract and theoretically consistent form of the historical course of events, a corrected mirror image, but corrected according to laws which the real course of history itself provides, in that every element can be considered in its classical stage, the stage of full maturity. That is the only way to surmount the real flaws in Hegelian logic, through a scientific comprehension of that real motion which is reflected in the motion of logic. Hence, in Hegel's logic, motion may rightly be criticized as mysticized, but this criticism will only take evolution beyond the Hegelian stage if the correct relation is established between what is reflected and the reflection. This cannot be done on an idealist basis. Trendelenburg, in company with others, discovered individual idealist flaws in Hegelian dialectics with occasional perspicacity, although frequently lapsing into triviality, but the result of their critiques can only be either a universal rejection of dialectics or the construction of a subjectivist pseudo-dialectic. Kierkegaard's role in the history of irrationalism is based on the fact that he took the latter tendency to a radical conclusion, so that at the time of his revival in the imperialist age, very little that was new could be added to what he had already expounded. He put paid to Hegelian dialectics and dissolved them just as completely, in substance, as Schopenhauer, with the one difference that whereas the latter wrote off dialectics block as hot air, Kierkegaard seemingly countered them with a different dialectic, laying claim to a higher value, a so-called qualitative dialectic. However, all the key conditions constituting the dialectical method are radically eliminated from this dialectic. Thus, qualitative dialectics signify above all a denial of the conversion from quantity into quality. Kierkegaard did not even think it worth the trouble to develop a detailed polemic on the theme, contenting himself with an ironic reference to the absurdity of this Hegelian theory. It is therefore heresy to think in logic that a new quality may originate through a continued quantitative determining, and it is an unacceptable fudging of the issue if, without concealing that all is not quite right, one hides the consequence of this proposition for the whole of logical immanence by including it in logical motion, as Hegel does. The new quality comes with the freshness, the jump, and the suddenness of the enigmatic. 186. These thoughts do not have very much substance, since they are merely declarative without proving anything. But they are very characteristic of Kierkegaard's attitude to the problems of dialectics. Here he chiefly echoes Trendelenburg's criticism that Hegel's mistake was to deal with such a question under the heading of logic, and especially as a problem of motion, and in a note appended to this criticism, he sought to clarify the history of this problem. Like Trendelenburg before him, Kierkegaard strove here as elsewhere to lay down spontaneous Greek dialectics as the only model and one that also applied to his times, i.e., he was striving to annul all the advances made by dialectics in classical German philosophy, Hegel's especially, on the historical plane as well. After mentioning Schelling's tendency to explain distinctions quantitatively, he said of Hegel in closing, Hegel's misfortune is precisely that he wants to validate the new quality and yet does not want to, since he wants to validate it in logic. But the latter must acquire a quite different awareness of itself and its meaning as soon as this is recognized. Here Kierkegaard does not offer a clear statement, and it cannot even be verified if he ever became conscious of not only contesting a crucially original principle that carried the development of dialectics far beyond the stage of antiquity, but also of rejecting the very principle which, for Hegel, was the intellectual means of his tentative comprehension of revolution, a necessary historical element. It is no accident that the idea of the conversion of quantity into quality already cropped up during Hegel's Berne period in this very context. The great, conspicuous revolutions must have been preceded by a quiet, secret revolution in the spirit of the age, one not apparent to everybody. An unfamiliarity with these revolutions in the spiritual world will then cause surprise at the outcome. This connection of the quantity-quality problem with the intellectual grasp of revolution manifests itself in Hegel's further development and receives in logic the universal definition of the leap, a necessary element of change, growth, and decay in nature and history. Closer acquaintance with Kierkegaard's mental world will show two things. Firstly, that the denial of this element of evolution, the most important one, was as much of a central philosophical problem for him as its rationale was for Hegel. And secondly, that the fight against revolution occupied the center of his worldview, much as the deduction of the contemporary situation from revolution occupied the center of Hegel's. The passage from Kierkegaard we have quoted shows only the extreme consequences of this position, and not its whole scope. His chief concern here was to make a sharp division between the religio-moral sphere and the leap in it on the one hand, and the process of gradual, quantifiable origination on the other. Hence, with regard to the qualitative leap, he stresses the suddenness of the enigmatic, i.e., the character of the irrational. In that the leap is divided from the transition of quantity, its irrational character comes about as a matter of necessity. So while it seems that we are only dealing with a tiny fragment, a single question in Kierkegaard's worldview, it is already clear with what strict inevitability the denial of dialectical principles leads to irrationalism, if this denial is thought out to a logical conclusion, and if there is no eclectic blunting of its edge, happens in Trendelenburg. And therefore, as we shall see more and more distinctly in the course of our discussion, Kierkegaard's qualitative dialectics are not a new and different dialectic set in antithesis to Hegelian dialectics, but a repudiation of dialectics. And since with Kierkegaard, who was disputing the most advanced dialectical form of his time, this occurs not fortuitously in the forms, categories, and terminology of dialectics themselves, there arises a pseudo-dialectic, and irrationalism is clad in pseudo-dialectical forms. This is the most essential step, the one with the greatest repercussions on irrationalism's later history, that Kierkegaard takes beyond Schelling and Schopenhauer. The latter represents dialectics as pure nonsense, hence Schopenhauer's universal success during the period of positivism. Schelling countered the most advanced dialectical form of his time with a more primitive one, and even this was distorted. Hence, the collapse of Hegelianism was bound to plunge this answer to it into the same abyss. Naturally, the dominance of positivism also obstructed Kierkegaard's general international influence for decades. Only when Hegel's dialectics were converted into an irrationalist pseudo-dialectic at the time of his imperialist revival, only when the campaign against the real highest form of dialectics, the suppression and discrediting of Marxism-Leninism, became bourgeois philosophy's central task, did Kierkegaard reappear internationally as a dialectician in tune with the age. In this regard, it is significant that Kierkegaard's own central philosophical problem, the campaign against Hegel, came to matter less and less. They now stood shoulder to shoulder in an increasingly fraternal and amiable fashion. Indeed, modern Hegel interpretation contained a growing amount of existentialist, irrationalist Kierkegaardian motives. If we now use the term pseudo-dialectic, we do so because every irrationalism, as far as it is concerned with logical problems, always resorts to formal as opposed to dialectical logic. With Schopenhauer, this happened quite overtly. The portentous change occurring with Kierkegaard consisted precisely in the masking of this recourse to formal logic and metaphysical thought as a qualitative dialectic, a pseudo-dialectic. This retrograde movement to formal logic plus irrationalism in the guise of a pseudo-dialectic, in order to thwart and advance beyond Hegelian dialectics, had to be aimed first and foremost against those elements in Hegel constituting his idealist, inconsequential progressiveness at that time, against the historical and social nature of the dialectical method. Hence, it is typical of Kierkegaard, and here again, he continued along the path taken by Trendelenburg, that he did not criticize the abstract forms of dialectics, those of the ancient Greeks, and above all, Heraclitus and Aristotle. On the contrary, in affirming them, he strove to find a weapon against Hegel. Whereas Marx and Lenin discovered in Aristotle these seeds of dialectics and developed them further, Trendelenburg and Kierkegaard took care to reduce Aristotle to formal logic once more, so as to do away with the Hegelian achievements in dialectics. Whereas Hegel already emphasizes strongly the patently dialectical tendencies in Heraclitus in order to work out the abstract framework of a dialectical method, and Marx and Lenin too vigorously stressed the materialist tendencies in him, Kierkegaard sought to read that genuine form into the historically determined abstract generality of Heraclitan dialectics so as to turn them into a refutation of Hegel's spurious dialectics. This spurious element in Hegel was precisely the historical and social nature of his dialectics. As we have already noted, it was just this which constituted the step forward taken by Hegel. He made conscious and raised to a method the historicity and sociality of dialectics. In fact, he had a number of forerunners in this respect. It will suffice to refer to Vico, Rousseau, or Herder. Before Hegel, however, with the Greeks, Nicholas of Cusa, and in the Renaissance, the dialectical method was not yet associated, qua method, with the objective structure and the objective laws of movement of history and society. A considerable part of Hegel's progressiveness lies in this association. His limitation lies in the fact that, as an idealist, he was unable to carry these principles through consistently. The dissolution of Hegelianism, before Marx took the decisive step to the materialist overthrow of Hegelian dialectics, has the peculiarity that the attempts to break through the Hegelian barriers engendered a retrograde movement in these questions objectively. Bruno Bauer, in the effort to develop Hegelian dialectics further in a revolutionary way, lapsed into the extreme subjective idealism of a philosophy of self-consciousness. By thus caricaturing, as the young Marx was already demonstrating at that time, the subjectivist aspects of the phenomenology, and by reducing Hegel to Fichte, he too eliminated the social and historical motives from dialectics and made them far more abstract than they were in Hegel himself. He thus dehistoricized and desocialized dialectics. This tendency reaches a climax which tilts over into the absurdly paradoxical with Stirner. On the other hand, the materialist turn we find in Feuerbach, since it was not a turn to dialectical materialism, but the opposite, a demolishing of dialectics, was generally speaking a similar switch to the desocializing and dehistoricizing of subject and object in philosophy. Hence, Marx rightly said of Feuerbach, as far as Feuerbach is a materialist, history does not occur for him, and as far as he takes history into account, he is not a materialist. Renint, and several decades later, Engels demonstrated that man, the subject of Feuerbach's philosophy, therefore does not live in a real world originating in and determined by history. 191 Kierkegaard linked himself with the aforestated tendencies of the dissolution of Hegelianism, although Hegel's philosophy itself formed the main object of his polemics. It was these trends and ideas which determined his polemics' tendency and method to a large extent, and we may state by way of an advanced summary, Kierkegaard took to a radical conclusion all the philosophical arguments which dehistoricized and desocialized Hegelian dialectics. What, in those arguments, was a mere product of the analytical process became ossified in Kierkegaard into a radical irrationalism. This connection also shows how far we are justified 192 in regarding Kierkegaard and Marx in the same historical context. As long as we clearly see how Marx achieved the decisive step of raising dialectics to a really scientific method, while at the same time perceiving how the analytical method of idealist dialectics, which Marx could simply lay aside in surmounting Hegel, became with Kierkegaard the cornerstone of the most highly advanced irrationalist philosophy, which had hitherto existed. This sharp contrast may also be portrayed as follows. Marx wrote in his Feuerbach critique that the individual's real spiritual wealth depends entirely on the wealth of his real connections. In the new scientific dialectic, man is comprehended as essentially historical and social, so as to make us clearly recognize that to overlook his essential nature at any time is to turn our concept of him into a distorted abstraction. In contrast, Kierkegaard's irrationalism and H's qualitative dialectic rest on the fact that in this dialectic, the distorted abstraction is presented as the sole true reality, the sole genuine human existence. Hence, history and society need to be abolished in Kierkegaard's philosophy in order to create space for the existent.ce of the artificially isolated individual, the only existence which is relevant here. Let us start by considering Kierkegaard's struggle against the historicism of Hegelian dialectics. Above all, Kierkegaard recognized that the Hegelian view of history, whatever Hegel himself may have thought about it, is atheistic in its objective psyche. Bruno Bauer before him already gave clear expression to this in The Trumpet of the Last Judgment. The world's spirit only finds its reality in the human mind, or it is nothing but the concept of mind, developing and perfecting itself in the historical spirit and its self-consciousness. It has no domain to itself, no world or heaven to itself. Self-consciousness is the only power in the world and history has no other meaning than that of the becoming and development of self-consciousness. 194. It may be said without exaggeration that Kierkegaard's great polemic against Hegel is a trumpet with the value sign reversed. Kierkegaard rejected Hegel's philosophy of history because of its atheism. Hence, God does not play the master eye in the world historical process as men see it. In the world historical process, God is laced metaphysically into a corset, half metaphysical, half aesthetico-dramatic, a corset that is immanence. May the devil be God in this way. Kierkegaard sees quite correctly that there is no more scope for God in a world history which is conceived as a uniform process with its own laws, and that Hegel's philosophy of history, despite all the references to the world spirit, God, and so on, can therefore be only a polite form of atheism. Evidently, he quite failed to grasp in all its implications the most important progressive idea in Hegel's view of history, namely the idea that man has become human through his own labor, and that men themselves make their history, even if they bring about something completely different from what they intended. Kierkegaard saw only the objective necessity, independent of individual will and consciousness, of the course of history as portrayed by Hegel, and protested against it in the name of God. As a result of involvement with the idea of the state and social idea and community and society, God can no longer take hold of the single individual. However, great God's wrath, the punishment designed for the guilty person, must propagate itself through all the authorities. In this way, God has been excluded in practice, in the most binding and appreciative philosophical termini. And the disappearance of all dialectics from the world picture, the conversion of dialectical into a formal logic, are expressed in the disappearance of all human activity from Kierkegaard's account of history, and the conversion into a pure fatalism of the objectivity of history. Naturally, Kierkegaard took this Hegelian view of history, in his own distorted interpretation of it, as an insult to God. The world historical drama advances infinitely slowly. Why does God not make haste if this is all that he wants? What undramatic forbearance, or rather what a prosaic and tedious dawdling. And if this is all that he wants, how horrible of him to expend myriads of human lives like some tyrant. At bottom, this gives rise to a total repudiation of historicity. Here, Kierkegaard came very close to Schopenhauer. But as a result of the circumstances under which he developed his theory of the denial of historicity in combating Hegel's historicism, the overall conception nonetheless acquires a different accent. There is a history, but not for man as a participant, but exclusively for God as the only spectator capable of surveying the entire course of history in its total edie. The unique and complex problem of the knowledge of history, viz., that we are active producers of history and can still perceive it in its objective principles, hence that, here again, action and contemplation are closely linked with each other, dialectically, was one whose unraveling Hegel strove for and surmised methodologically, rather than actually solved. Kierkegaard unraveled it with the proposition that action and contemplation are strictly separate, that man, who acts in a concrete and hence necessarily more or less small sector of history, is quite unable in theory to survey the whole. Knowledge of history in its totality remains the prerogative of God alone. Kierkegaard wrote, "Let me now use a metaphor to remind us of the difference between the ethical and world historical, the individual's ethical relationship to God and world history's relationship to God. The individual's ethical development, then, is the small private theater where the spectator is God, but also the individual man himself, occasionally, although he is meant in essence to be an actor. World history, on the other hand, is the royal arena reserved for God, where he is essentially, and not by chance, the one spectator, because he is the only one who be. The entrance to this theater is closed to any spirit in existence. If this spirit imagines itself to be a spectator, it is merely forgetting that it is itself meant to be an actor in the little theater, leaving it to that royal spectator and dramatist how the latter wishes to employ it in the royal drama. The difference between Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard is thus reduced to the fact that Kierkegaard did not proclaim the plain senselessness of the course of history, which, after all, would similarly be bound to lead to atheistic consequences. Instead, he attempted to save religion and God by means of a consistent historical agnosticism. It looks as if Kierkegaard was thereby turning back to the theodicies of the 17th and 18th centuries, which try to pin down intellectually the contradictory and refractory elements in manifested history by invoking its totality, seen from the vantage point of God's omniscience. But the distinct tie-in that these also ascribe to human perception, an approximative knowledge, or at least a notion of history's true, complete interconnections, is only apparently a difference of degree compared to Kierkegaard's radical agnosticism. It expresses the qualitative difference between two evolutionary periods, the gradual withdrawal of the claim to a religious interpretation of concrete phenomena in history in the face of the scientific explanation of the world, which was gaining ground with increasing vigor. Religion had to leave bigger and bigger parts of the phenomenal world to objectively scientific research and withdraw increasingly to the pure inner man. In Kierkegaard, too, this retreat is clearly visible. An objectively religious person in the objective human mass does not fear God. He does not hear God in the thunder, for that is a law of nature, and perhaps he is right, nor does he see God in outward events, for that is the necessity of the immanence of cause and effect, and perhaps he is right. 199. Kierkegaard's historical agnosticism is therefore an attempt, like Schleiermacher's previously, to abandon to science all the outposts of world elucidation that could no longer be defended, in order to find in pure inwardness a terrain where it seemed to him that religion could be rescued and reinstated, philosophically. Obviously, this retreat had to move in the direction of irrationalism, for with regard to the problems of pure inwardness, the surrender of the external world's rationality inevitably turns into irrationalism. Therefore, the affinity between the positions of Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard also manifests itself in the fact that with both of them, the repudiation of history, or its knowability, implies a profound pessimism. If all events remain thrown back on the individual, mentally isolated from history and all human community, this will make his life not only irrational in general, but also irrational in the sense of complete futility and absurdity. Hence, in both cases, with, to be sure, a very different accentuation, despair is the basic category of all human behavior. There is a difference between them, which is important to the development of irrationalism. It is that, with Kierkegaard, there arose a mythicized pseudo-history with a qualitative dialectic in place of Schopenhauer's overtly anti-dialectical anti-historicism. Certainly, the historical element, with Kierkegaard, is only an irrationalist abyss dividing the whole of history into two, the appearance of Christ in history. Accordingly, his historicity is a contradictory paradox. On the one hand, it means a change in the purpose, content, form, etc., of every mode of human conduct. Here, therefore, the different and indeed opposed character of historical periods is to be deduced from the structural transformation of the cardinal intellectual types, ethical behavior, and so on, as later with Dilthey and other proponents of Geisteswissenschaft. On the other hand, this did not give rise to a real periodizing of a real historical course of events. It is a unique, sudden leap in the middle of a history which is otherwise motionless. For the philosophical point of the fragments lies just in the fact that with regard to the relationship of the inner man to Christ, the sole, essential relation in Kierkegaard's view, the 2 millennia that have passed in the meantime have no significance and cannot mediate in any way for those who have lived later. Kierkegaard wrote, "There are no pupils at one remove." In essence, the first and last are the same. It is just that the later generation finds an inducement in the report of contemporary witnesses, whereas Christ's contemporaries have this inducement in its immediate simultaneity and owe nothing to another generation in this respect. But this immediate simultaneity is the inducement only. 200. Thus history, again, does not exist in respect of the one matter which appeared essential about history to Kierkegaard, namely the salvation of the individual man through the appearance of Christ. Certainly, this qualitative dialectical negation of historicity has the greatest importance for the philosophical essence of Kierkegaard's thinking. Whereas with Schopenhauer, the intuitive experience of true reality is directly nothingness, located beyond space, time, and causality, beyond the individuation principle. With Kierkegaard, it is only the individual's subjectivity developed to extremes which can attain to the highest and only genuine stage of reality, paradox. And this qualitative dialectical pseudo-historicity is not to be separated from just the essence of paradox. Eternal truth has origin aided in time, that is the paradox, wrote Kierkegaard. 2.1. Here Kierkegaard distinguished, and this becomes very important to irrationalism's later development, the simple historical fact, both from the absolute fact, which is similarly held to be historical, but in a quite different sense, and from the eternal fact situated right outside the historical course of events. This marks the creation of the methodological model for all later irrationalist distinctions, from that of Bergson between abstract time and real duration, to Heidegger's contrast between authentic and vulgar historicity. And with all the irrationalists who came after Kierkegaard, authentic time or history is always subjective and merely experienced as opposed to objective. According to Kierkegaard, only someone who receives the condition from God himself has access to the absolute fact and can become a pupil of Christ. For the simple historical fact, on the contrary, an approximative knowledge is both possible and necessary. This distinction has a major bearing on the character of Kierkegaard's qualitative dialectic. In order, however, to appraise it fully, we must first consider the historical milieu in which it originated. It was the decade of the writings of D.F. Strauss, Bruno Bauer, and Feuerbach, and therefore especially where the first two are concerned, the age of the scientific, historical analysis of gospel tradition. Kierkegaard saw clearly that the factual historicity of Christ contained in the gospel traditions could not be defended any longer on the basis of a study of history that was at all scientific. Therefore, he did not polemicize directly against the theories of Strauss or Bauer in order to rescue this historicity itself in the sense of a scientific objectivity, but extended his philosophical methodology so as to disparage and discredit, with regard to its philosophical cognitive value, the whole kind of historical knowledge that had led to such findings. He saw clearly that the historical reality of the Christ figure outlined in the Gospels was completely dissipated on a basis of scientific debate. His polemic was therefore leveled exclusively against the competence of the historical mode of examination in these questions concerning true reality and existence. With the general dismissal of the knowability of the historical process in its totality, we are already acquainted. Now we must recall the fact that Kierkegaard's qualitative dialectic rejected in theory the passage from quantity into quality, and thus a leap deduced through rational dialectics and therefore explained scientifically. The epistemological rationale of Kierkegaard's attitude to history, whittled down to the problem of the knowability of Christ's historical appearance, was now accomplished in an extended polemic against the worth of any knowing based on approximation. This too shows us how radically this qualitative dialectic demolishes all the essential elements of real dialectics. It was one of the major achievements of Hegelian dialectics that they tried to argue scientifically the concrete reciprocity between absolute and relative elements of knowledge. The doctrine of the approximative character of our knowledge is the necessary result of these endeavors. Approximation, in this context, means that the relative element's irremovable presence does not annul the objective, absolute, character of a correct knowledge, but merely denotes the stage our knowledge has reached in the process of advancing approximation in the given phase. Approximation's objective basis is that the concrete phenomenal object is always richer and more substantial than are those laws with whose aid we seek to know it. No kind of relativism, therefore, is contained in the consequent Hegelian conception of approximation, especially in the materialist further development it underwent with Marx, Engels, and Lenin, where the reflection of objective reality guarantees the absolute element. Here Hegel himself, because of his idealistically mysticizing starting point of the identical subject-object, was unable to achieve any final clarity. But if we compare his version of dialectical approximation with the infinite progress of our knowledge as taught by Kant, we see the extraordinary advance. According to Kant, the realm of true reality is eternally closed to us because of the unknowability of the thing in itself. With Kant, infinite progress moves exclusively in the medium of the phenomenal world, separated from this true objectivity. Despite all Kant's efforts to introduce into this sphere the element of objective knowledge, the imminent tendency to a subjectivism and relativism remains ineradicable, since the disposition of the subject of knowledge can offer only an extremely problematic guarantee of its objectivity. Here, Kierkegaard also contested Hegel by splitting the vital dialectical unity of the contradictory elements and puffing them up in their rigid isolation to autonomous metaphysical principles. Thus the element of approximation became the principle of pure relativism. Kierkegaard wrote, "Historical knowing is an illusion, since it is an approximative knowing, thrang," and his demonstrations show how much he was focusing exclusively on the bad infinitude of a philological historical discipline and excluding any element of objectivity from this approximation from the very outset. The world historical material is infinite, and a delimiting must therefore rest on some kind of arbitrariness. Although the world historical is something past, it is not finished as material for percipient contemplation, but arises through ever-new observation and investigation, which is always making discoveries or amending them. Just as in the natural sciences, one augments the number of discoveries by sharpening the instruments, one can also do so with the world historical by intensifying the critical observation. 204. So as we see, Kierkegaard converted approximation to objective reality into a pure relativism by giving it the slant that the scientific progress which every further approximation signifies in this respect is in truth a march into nothingness. For a really objective knowledge is not attainable at all in this way, and the principle of selection and limitation is pure arbitrariness. This nihilistic attitude to knowledge of objective reality rests on the fact that, for Kierkegaard, there is no question whatever of a real influencing of our perceiving relation by reality existing independently of our consciousness. Subjectivity decides everything. The only question is whether this subjectivity is genuine or false, passionately interested and intimately linked with the thinker's existence, or shallow and indifferent. And the objection which Kierkegaard made to Hegel's scientific knowledge of history is that this knowledge lacked infinite interestedness, passion and pathos, and therefore degenerated into idle curiosity, a magpie learning, knowledge for its own sake. Thus, he directed his attack against the purely eon-templative character of knowledge in classical German philosophy, whose objectivity arises from just this absence of the subjective attitude. This is not the only time we find that a critique of real central flaws in idealist dialectics has become the starting point of the retrograde movement to irrationalism. The criticism of the old contemplative nature of Hegel's philosophy of history is not wholly unfounded here, although all along Kierkegaard presented a distorted caricature of Hegel and completely eliminated the vague pointers which his philosophy of history provides in the direction of praxis. However, this relatively justified critique of mere contemplation of history, of a history that has nothing to do with cardinal human problems in life, Kierkegaard used as a rationale for his specifically irrationalist denial of all real historicity. In the first place, an absoluteness of existence, praxis, and interestedness is posited to counter the worthless relativist contemplative attitude, an absoluteness which purports to contain no element of relativity or approximation. Thereupon, the absolute and the relative, contemplation and action, are transformed into neatly divided, sharply antithetical metaphysical potencies. A Christian is a person who accepts the teaching of Christianity. But if, in the last analysis, the what of this teaching decides whether a person is a Christian, then our attention is instantly turned outwards in order to find out what the Christian teaching is down to the smallest detail. Because this what is supposed to decide not what Christianity is, but whether I am a Christian. In the same instant, there begins the learned, concerned, and anxious contradiction of approximating. Approximation may be continued as long as we wish, and by way of it, the decision whereby the individual becomes a Christian is ultimately forgotten altogether. But in the second place, we must not only look at the methodology in the passage just quoted. Certainly, this has a significance crucial to irrationalism's development, for it shows how, with each step in the concretization of the qualitative dialectic, all real dialectical categories and interconnections are removed and the dialectic is converted back into a metaphysic. This was the methodological model for many movements in the imperialist age, especially existentialism, which was conscientiously affiliated to Kierkegaard, albeit without express theology, and indeed in an atheist guise. The opposition we have demonstrated between absolute and relative became the core of Heidegger's philosophy. But exceeding this abstract methodology, although very closely related to it, is the concrete Kierkegaardian antithesis. The antithesis between solely absolute individual subjectivity on the one hand, and on the other, the abstract generality of socio-historical life, which inevitably vanishes into the nothingness of relativism. An absolutely clear-cut gulf has now opened up between the quantitative dialectic of mere approximation in the knowledge of history and the qualitative dialectic of the essential, existential, infinitely interested human relation. It is the Kierkegaardian gulf between theory and praxis, an antagonism which in this instance implies an antagonism between history and ethics. In the paradoxical definition of this antitheticality, Kierkegaard goes so far as to declare constant association with the world historical causes unfitness for action. 2.6 Action, for Kierkegaard, means an ethical enthusiasm whereby one must never think of whether one is thereby accomplishing something or not. This antagonism implies the absolute incompatibility of the ethical with any human tendency to orient one's action to historical reality or to historical progress, which does not even exist in Kierkegaard's view. The ethical takes place in a purely individual, purely inwardly looking medium. All relating of action to quantitative dialectical historical reality must therefore have a distracting effect, removing man from the ethical realm and destroying the ethical element within him. The relation to history neutralizes the absolute ethical distinction between good and evil in the aesthetico-metaphysical definition, the great, the significant, on the world historical and aesthetic plane. 207. It is a downright temptation to associate too much with world history, a temptation which can lead to the desire to be world historical as well, whenever one should act for oneself. In being continually occupied with that contingent, adventitious factor through which world historical figures become what they are, one can be easily misled into confusing these with the ethical element and into contemplating one's own navel and showing a craven concern for the adventitious, instead of being ceaselessly concerned with the ethical factor in one's own existence. Hence, Kierkegaard could sum up his thinking as follows. World historical immanence is always confusing for the ethical realm, and yet world historical contemplation lies in immanence. If an individual sees an ethical element, it is the ethical within himself. For it would not be right to conclude, the more ethically advanced a person is, the more that person will see the ethical in world history. No, the very opposite applies. The more he develops ethically, the less concerned he will be about the world historical realm. We have now reached the central problem of Kierkegaard's philosophy, the real reason why he contested Hegelian dialectics. One of the most important motives in the dissolution of Hegelianism was its inadequate historicity, which did not point into the future. For all the mental confusion and woolliness of the left Hegelians, they were spiritually united in challenging this. It was this crisis which engendered that view of history, which is not only qualitatively superior, but also exclusively scientific, and for the first time illuminates past, present, and future in a really clear way, namely historical materialism. Without suspecting this momentous outcome to the philosophical crisis of his times, but conscientiously polemicizing against the radical young Hegelians, Kierkegaard originated this new form of irrationalism, the most advanced so far. The pseudo-dialectical repudiation of history, and the attempt to extrude, in the very name of his action, the man of action from all historical interconnections. This is the meaning of the sharp antagonism of ethics and history, the antithesis between a praxis conceived in a purely subjective individual light and an illusory immanence, an illusory historical objectivity. Now, the next step in making Kierkegaard's philosophy more concrete must be to elucidate what these ethics mean. It will be already clear from our studies that they signify not only man's dehistoricizing, but at the same time and going inseparably hand in hand with it, his desocialization. Kierkegaard did not draw this inference at once and never drew it in a completely radical manner. Indeed, his position is even more contradictory here than on the historical question. For we saw that he was obliged to counter the Hegelian view of history with an ethic, and he constantly accused Hegelian philosophy in general terms of lacking an ethic. Thus, ethics appear to be Kierkegaard's effective answer to the claim laid in Hegel to history's objective immanence, a methodological tool for arguing subjectivity as the basis of truth. But is an ethic possible if man is not viewed as a social being? Here let us avoid all discussion of Aristotle and Hegel, for whom this was axiomatic. Kant's Gesinnungsethik, the ego-based Fichtian ethic, and even Schleiermacher's were similarly unable and unwilling to renounce altogether the sociality which even conceptually is inseparable from the essence of man. Naturally, the resultant inner contradictions lie outside the scope of our present studies. Here we must confine ourselves to showing briefly that these contradictions were not individual limitations in the thinking of single philosophers, but efforts to come to terms intellectually with the objective contradictions in bourgeois society that had emerged with the Declaration of Human Rights in the American and French revolutions. Marx, polemicizing against Bruno Bauer, formulated their social basis as follows in the German-French yearbooks. Political revolution dissolves bourgeois life into its component elements without revolutionizing these elements themselves and submitting them to criticism. It treats bourgeois society, the world of needs, labor, private interests, and personal right, as the foundation of its existence. Hypothesis argued no further, and hence as its natural basis. Ultimately, man as a member of bourgeois society is taken for authentic man, for the home as distinct from the citoyen, because he is man in his sensual, individual nearest existence, whereas political man is only an abstracted, artificial man. Man is an allegorical, moral person. Real man is only acknowledged in the shape of the egotistic individual, true man only in the shape of the abstract citoyen. Bourgeois philosophy expresses in very conflicting forms these contradictions between real and true man pervading the entire life of society. Either thinkers will attempt, without having discerned the true interrelations, a conceptual systematization of human activity from the angle of bourgeois society like Hegel, in which case the antithesis of the world historical and the supporting individual crops up as an uncomprehended contradiction. Or they will endeavour to advance from individual ethics to the problems of social praxis, as was the case with, above all, Kant and Fichte, and with the Smith-Bentham school in England. Here we cannot examine in more detail the very graduated variations in these often extremely distorted reflections of a fundamental conflict in bourgeois society. But it can be stated that the duality and unity of citoyen and bourgeois growing out of life determines the structure, superstructure, propositions, etc. of the entire bourgeois ethic. And the shift to reactionary rationalism finds expression as early as the German Romantic period in the attempt to weaken, diminish, and indeed do away with the citoyen in man. Kierkegaard, too, especially at the beginning, could not wholly escape these universally bourgeois propositions. In his first major work, Either Or, ethics not only occupy a very important place. Here, in contrast to the desperate solipsism of the aesthetic phase, the function of the ethical relation consists precisely in realizing the universal. Regarded in abstractly formal terms, somewhat from the standpoint of Kierkegaard's system building, this position and function of ethics as the link between aesthetics and religion remained unchanged. In reality, however, with the concrete development of Kierkegaard's worldview and philosophical method, this sociality of ethics and their realization of the universal became more and more problematic and contradictory, so that, considered objectively, they increasingly dissolved into nothing. To be sure, we must not overestimate the sociality of even the early Kierkegaard's ethics. We would seek in vain for that wealth of human social relations which characterizes ethics with Hegel. They are, in essence, ethics of the private person, except that, as yet, Kierkegaard could not possibly blind himself to the fact that the private person, even as such, lives in society. In this early phase, the advocate of the ethical vision of life declares, "I am wont to appear in public as a husband, because that is really my most important position in life." 2:10. And precisely in polemical dispute with conscious immediacy and the solipsistic subjectivity of the aesthetic stage, the ethical categories are inevitably presented as those of the generality of man's life as it is consciously lived in society. Marriage, Kierkegaard makes his ethical advocate say in the later stages on the road of life 2:11, is the foundation of bourgeois life. Through it a man and woman in love are bound to the state and the fatherland and the common public interest. But in accordance with Kierkegaard's whole conception, the ethical sphere is only a transitional sphere, 212, a bridge to the authentic reality of the subjectivity, which alone has existence, a bridge to the religious relation. Hence we must briefly investigate how it is that these bridging ethics are not sublimed in the Hegelian sense, and thus both surpassed and preserved, but completely dissipated and destroyed instead. Here, naturally, we cannot take it upon ourselves to give a full account of Kierkegaard's ethics systematically, or even in their historical genesis. Our one concern is to indicate the decisive philosophical motives which of necessity entailed this inner collapse of those ethics. A principal motive was the polemic against the Hegelian dialectical identification of the internal and external, a polemic of the greatest importance to Kierkegaard's philosophy. With Hegel, this identification has the epistemological purpose of refuting the subjective idealist division of phenomenon and essence, and showing them to be inseparably connected dialectically in contradictoriness. The external is thus primarily the same content as the internal. What is internal is also present externally and vice versa. The phenomenon exhibits nothing that is not in the essence. and there is nothing in the essence that is not manifested. This signifies for ethics, here we must pass over all the intermediate conditions, that it must be said, a man is what he does. Kierkegaard saw in this position Hegel's endeavor to apply the category of the aesthetico-metaphysical to ethics and religion. But he expounds this as follows. Already the ethical poses a kind of antithetical relation between the external and internal, inasmuch as it sets the external in indifference. As the material of the deed, the external is indifferent, for the ethical emphasis is placed on intention, the outcome being indifferent as the external side of the deed. The religious posits the antithesis between the external and internal definitely as antithesis, and therein lies precisely suffering as an existential category for the religious, but therein also lies the internal, inwardly directed infinitude of inwardness. It will be clear without going into details that the view that the entire external life is wholly indifferent for ethics also demolishes the private ethical construction of Kierkegaard's stages. For how is marriage, to dwell on Kierkegaard's own very restricted interpretation of the realization of the universal, conceivable as a sphere of ethics, as a higher and no longer merely immediate stage of love, if the purely inward conditions, those remaining purely subjective, have sole ethical relevance for every marriage partner, and if the consequences of the one partner's aforestated convictions, deeds, etc., have to be regarded as wholly indifferent for the other partner's life. For in that case, marriage is no longer distinguishable from the aesthetically immediate solipsism of eroticism, where the lovers belong to two completely separate worlds and cannot communicate with each other on the human plane at all. Certainly Kierkegaard was at pains to sublime ethically the sensual aesthetic immediacy of love. But this endeavor could only result in something if marriage, in his account, were to create a real human communion between husband and wife. And Kierkegaard indeed attempted to follow this course in his writings, especially either or. But as soon as he begins to develop H's thinking's epistemological and philosophical foundations, it turns out that even that extremely limited circle of human relations which his ethics allow is irreconcilable with these foundations. Kierkegaard offers the clearest evidence that an ethic of conviction taken to a rigorous conclusion can only produce a moral solipsism. But this objective tendency in Kierkegaard to the self-dissolution of ethics is not, as seen from the angle of the logic of his system, the sole decisive reason why ethics and the extremely modest sociality permitted in them recede increasingly into the background. The crucial factor is his basic view of the religious element. We have already noted how important a motive the accusation was, in his polemic against the immanence of Hegel's dialectical view of history, that this necessarily ousts God from history, thereby providing a historical rationale for atheism. In the first work, in which Kierkegaard's theory of religion appears overtly and concretely, the same question crops up with regard to ethics. Not, to be sure, in so violently polemical a form as with regard to history, but no less decidedly in essence. Here Kierkegaard defined ethics as the universal, that which is valid for all. ch2.5. They are immanent, have their objective within themselves, and do not point beyond themselves. The ethical is as such the universal, that which is valid for all, expressed from another angle, that which is valid at every moment. It rests immanently in itself. It has nothing outside itself that constitutes its telos, but is itself telos for everything it has outside of itself. When it has assumed this within itself, it goes no farther. He closes this observation with the significant words, "If this is the utmost that may be said of man and his existence, then the ethical has the same meaning as man's eternal bliss, which is man's telos in all eternity and at every instant. For it would be a contradiction for the possibility to exist that eternal bliss could be surrendered, i.e. suspended teleologically, since as soon as it is surrendered, it will be frittered away." Thus, to Kierkegaard's mind, an ethic which does not exceed the generality would be atheistic. Thus, in his extremely individualist irrationalist way, he answers the old question, often debated in bourgeois ethics since Bayle's day, of whether a society of atheists would be possible with a yes as regards the ethical possibility, although with a sharp no as regards his value judgment. And he added that if such a state of affairs obtained, Hegel's definition of the relation between the particular and universal, between the individual and society, would be correct. For Kierkegaard, therefore, the only saving factor of the religious element of faith is that the individual as the individual ranks higher than the universal. Granted, he repeatedly added that his individual did not proceed from immediacy, that before reaching these heights, he had to pass through the fulfillment of the universal in ethics. This, however, is an empty assertion, without any methodological significance for ethics whatever. For this sublimation of the ethical into the religious realm leaves no traces whatever behind it. From the standpoint of the individual, the paladin of faith who lives in paradox, a paradox forever inaccessible to thought, it is completely irrelevant whether he has really passed the stage of the predominance of the universal over the particular. As far as a connection can be established here, it rests on the fact that the Kierkegaardian stage of ethics was already far less rational and social than he represented it in this marked contrast with aesthetics on the one hand and religion on the other. As we have pointed out, Die Kierkegaardian ethic too acknowledges no common medium, no real community between men, and with regard to the ethically essential, the inner realm sharply divided from the exterior, those practicing this ethic likewise live in an insuperable incognito. The quantitative heightening occurring between ethics and religion, one that is converted into quality, seems to be based only on the fact that ethical solipsism, the incognito, contradicted the traditional categories with whose aid Kierkegaard formulated his ethics. Thus, whereas this incognito displayed a vacillating, relative character, his temperament found its appropriate medium in faith, in paradox, and in the absolute incognito. So the religious stage is, on the one hand, an aristocratic heightening of ethics, where, because of the predominance of the universal, the aristocratic principle of the chosen individual cannot be practiced so adequately as in the religious relation to life. On the other hand, the realization of the universal serves Kierkegaard's religious man as an ironical mask, as a deceptive and extremely petty bourgeois attitude, permanently concealing the latent pathos of the religious paladin of faith. Kierkegaard's entanglement in this web of contradictions certainly does not derive from the architectonic tripartite system construction of his stages. 217. There were social and philosophical reasons for it. Kierkegaard was always wanting to challenge the romantic ethical type of his age, with which, he sensed, his own intellectual persona was most profoundly related. In his case, however, this defensive stance was far more than psychological. Here we are dealing with something objective and more important, namely the socially determined deep-seated affinity between his conception of aesthetics and of religion. This applies above all to the methodology, where religion is not to be regarded as something objective as doctrine, and we have yet to see how passionately Kierkegaard rejected any such method. An attempt will arise to rescue it from the angle of the individual person's subjectivity and of religious experience, whereupon the close proximity to aesthetics is already irrefutable. For in both instances we are dealing, on the one hand, with a world picture steeped in fantasy whose truth and reality can only be argued from pure subjectivity. And on the other hand, we are dealing with an extremely subjectivist mode of behavior whose collisions with the universal again appear soluble only in the purely subjective evidence. Feuerbach, who studied Kierkegaard in great detail and esteemed him highly, already saw perfectly clearly, not your ally from a diametrically opposed viewpoint, with diametric ally opposite intentions and inferences, this affinity between aesthetics and religion with regard to the objectivity of that which is reflected in them. He resisted the idea that his dissolution of religion, because of the demonstration of its purely subjective character, was bound to entail a dissolution of poetry. So little, he wrote, do I annul art, poetry, and imagination that I rather annul religion only insofar as it is not poetry but ordinary prose. He did not dispute that religion may also be poetry. Poetry, however, does not profess that its creations are any different to what they are, whereas religion, however, makes its imagined beings out to be real beings. It eyes, needless to say, not only the basic philosophical tendency which is at opposite poles in Feuerbach and Kierkegaard, but accordingly the relation of aesthetics and religion as well. With the former, the discovery of the subjective character of religion signifies its dissolution, and aesthetics survive as an important part of man's terrestrial life. Thus, the aforestated affinity applies only within the terms of this hypothesis. With Kierkegaard, on the contrary, precisely the extremely rigorous subjectifying of the religious is deemed to provide a philosophical basis for religion itself and to establish its autonomy, its absolute validity through qualitative dialectics. It is patent that under these conditions, the separation of religion from the aesthetic sphere was bound to become for Kierkegaard a vital philosophical issue. With Feuerbach, the non-existence of its objects, where religion claimed their existence, in objective reality could easily elicit a clear delimiting. But for Kierkegaard, this problem was much more involved, and it jeopardized the whole survival of his system. This was not only because, in order to vindicate religion philosophically, he needed and wanted to prove that the existence of the religious sphere, contested by Feuerbach, was even the sole absolute reality. It was also because, in Kierkegaard, the aesthetic sphere denotes something different and far more comprehensive than in Feuerbach, not only products of art, their production and aesthetic contemplation, but also, primarily even, an aesthetic attitude to life. Not for nothing does the erotic play so crucial a role in Kierkegaard's aesthetics. In this we can see, despite all Kierkegaard's polemical digressions, an enduring and living legacy of Romanticism. With regard to this, the basic problem in his philosophy, he came very close in methodology to the moral philosopher of early Romanticism, the Schleiermacher of the talks on Religion and Intimate Letters on Friedrich Schlegel's Lucinde. Certainly the resemblance of the propositions is limited to the fact that, as a result of the passing of romantic aesthetics into an aesthetically determined art of living on the one hand, and of a religion founded purely on subjective experience on the other, the two areas were bound to mesh all the time. But just that was the young Schleiermacher's intention. It was just by that route that he sought to lead his romantic, aesthetically oriented generation back to religion and to encourage the romantic aesthetic and art of living to sprout into religiosity. If, then, the resemblance and the structural closeness of the two spheres were of advantage to Schleiermacher's arguments, the self-same factors gave rise to the greatest intellectual difficulties for Kierkegaard. This proximity, affinity, and unbridled overflowing of the one into the other, obtape both in early Romanticism and in Kierkegaard's works, as could be readily demonstrated at every point. Hooray, to indicate the affinity. Let us pick out from Kierkegaard journals just one passage that also clearly expresses the joint aristocratic opposition of both orientations to the mediocre majority of men. In 1854, and thus not in the romanticizing period of his youth, but at the time of his overt struggles to reinstate religion, Kierkegaard wrote, "Talent ranks in proportion to its arousing of sensation, genius in proportion to its arousing of resistance. Clearly, it is none too difficult here to draw a dividing line between talent and genius. But equally clearly, a high degree of theological irrationalist sophistry is needed to draw even a specious line between resistance and annoyance. That applies all the more in that this contrast again vividly expresses the aristocratic outlook shared by the Romantics and Kierkegaard. In this respect, Kierkegaard was a logical heir of Romantic thinkers. To him it was axiomatic that entry to every sphere he deemed essential was available only to the chosen. The reason why he defined the ethical stage in such a contradictory and self-defeating way was, the motives previously stated aside, the necessarily non-aristocratic character of ethic, which was intended to realize the universal. As soon as his ethics were translated into the paradoxically religious, Kierkegaard again found himself, in contradiction, it must be said, to his initial hypotheses, on the familiar basis of aristocratism. So the borderline between aesthetics and religion is just as blurred in his writings as in the Jena period of Friedrich Schlegel or Tieck and in Novalis and Schleiermacher. But whereas for the Romantic thinkers of Jena, these fluid, dividing lines were an attainable end, they implied for Kierkegaard's philosophy a danger which threatened to undo the whole system, a danger to be surmounted, and it never really was. It was more the changing times, the change in class relations, and the class struggle than the thinkers' personalities which determined this contrast in philosophical propositions, in spite of a deep-seated affinity in cardinal philosophical hypotheses. The untroubled merging of Romantic aesthetics and religion was very closely connected with the Thermidorian moods of the post-revolutionary intelligentsia in Germany. With the hope of managing to establish a harmonious art of living, subliming the crisis contradictions upon the basis of the new possibilities to be enjoyed in post-revolutionary society. Kierkegaard shared with the Romantics the life basis of a reactionary parasitical intelligentsia whose behavior in the capitalist society taking shape was strongly oriented to a subjectivist art of living. But since he was living in a deeply disturbed time of crisis, he had to try and rescue religion from its close relationship with aesthetics, and above all with the parasitic aesthetic art of living. In this respect, therefore, he represents the Ash Wednesday of the Romantic Carnival as much Heidegger represents that of the imperialist parasites in the universal capitalist crisis after the First World War, as opposed to the pre-war revels of Simmel or Bergson. So in appearance, and from his subjective emotional angle, Kierkegaard was far removed from early Romanticism in his conception of both aesthetics and religion. Certainly, we have just established the affinity of the structure of both spheres. And the difference in, indeed, antitheticality of, the emotional emphasis predominant in both spheres only reinforces this merging of them, which Kierkegaard did not intend and indeed fought against. For the atmosphere of the Kierkegaardian aesthetic stage is determined by despair. The aphoristic confessions of the aesthetician in Either or begin, "What is a poet? An unhappy man who in his heart harbors a deep anguish, but whose lips are so fashioned that the moans and cries which issue forth from them sound to the stranger like ravishing music. His fate is like that of the unfortunate victims whom the tyrant Phalaris slowly tortured in a brazen bull, over a low burning fire. Their cries could not reach the tyrant's ears so as to strike terror into him. To him they sounded like merry music, 220. And in Kierkegaard's reply to Plato's Symposium, in which representatives of the aesthetic stage gather and discuss their views of eroticism, J. Johannes the seducer, after hearing all the speeches, bursts out with the following reproaches to his companions. "My noble friends, has the devil got into you? For you are talking like mourners. Your eyes are red, not with wine, but with tears." 221. All Kierkegaard's aesthetic studies are pervaded by different shades of this despair. Now, as opposed to this, the religious relation shows a qualitative heightening and indeed a still profounder despair, an even stronger emphasis on the solipsism and irrationality in the subject left to its own devices. For in Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, to take Kierkegaard's paradigmatic example, that which distinguishes Abraham from the tragic hero consists just in the absolute incommensurability of the motives for his deed, the impossibility in principle of communicating his authentic, decisive experiences. But this is to proclaim a complete extinction of the ethically universal where the religious sphere is concerned. Here, comparing the sacrificing Abraham with the outwardly similar but inwardly merely tragic conflict of Agamemnon when called upon to sacrifice Iphigenia, Kierkegaard wrote, "The tragic hero too contrates in a moment the ethical, which he exceeds teleologically. But in so doing he has a prop in the universal. The paladin of faith depends solely and uniquely on his own resources, and that is the terrible thing." 222. Kierkegaard's. Abraham has nothing in common with a tragic hero, but is something quite different, either a murderer or a believer. What lies between and saves the tragic hero is not applicable to Abraham. So we have despair as a spiritual basis, irrationality as a content, and connected with it, the theoretical impossibility of spiritual communication between men, the absolute incognito. These, with Kierkegaard, characterize both the aesthetic and the religious. In order to give rise, at least in appearance, to a polarity of interrelated tendencies at least, but not a complete identity, Kierkegaard had to stress the anti-ethical aspect in aesthetics and the necessary passage through the ethical sphere in religion. And this although the ethical leaves no traces behind it, thus being wholly irrelevant to a concrete treatment of the problems, and, although the tragic, precisely in Kierkegaard's account of it, creates a more intimate bond between aesthetics and ethics than he ever established between ethics and religion. For as we have noted, the tragic hero seeks and finds his justification in the universal. Kierkegaard never succeeded in locating so strong a concrete link between ethics and religion. All the more intimate was his link between aesthetics and religion. Kierkegaard himself admits as much in his journals. Under the heading, On My Production, Seen as a Whole, he wrote, "In a certain sense, the contemporary age is faced with a choice. One must choose between making either the aesthetic sphere the total idea and explaining everything in these terms, or the religious." In our opinion, this desperate situation of his philosophy of despair forced Kierkegaard into the empty declaration of a relation between ethics and religion which never exists in his work. He was forced to make it to avoid admitting that his religion was nothing more than a refuge for stranded decadent aesthetes. And since Kierkegaard, in view of the period in which he lived, was not a Huysmans and still less a Camus, who both found in despair itself a vain and trifling self-satisfaction, he had to resort to such hollow constructions, unconsciously and reluctantly recognizing that a mental desocializing of man implies at the same time the annihilation of any ethics. To be sure, we find in Kierkegaard's oeuvre another, even more important motive, one that is outwardly constituted quite differently but closely linked with the above motive objectively, the social function he wished to assign to religion and to Christianity. Kierkegaard perceived the mounting crisis of his age. He was a romantic anti-capitalist, and the events of 1848 promoted his development in the sense that they brought all the seeds of the reactionary in him to fruition. As early 1849 he wrote in his Annals, "Should Providence go on sending prophets and judges, it must happen solely in order to assist the government." 2.25. Several years later he said very firmly, "My whole work is a defense of the established order." 26. And finally in 1854, when he thought that revolution could break out at any moment, he saw it as a dire misfortune that Christianity has been abolished as the regulating weight. 227. Kierkegaardian Christianity, by imprisoning the individual as such in his incognito, by rendering the whole world of society about him of no value to him, and concentrating his energies solely on the salvation of his own soul, was intended to become this weight. And this weight was calculated to regulate temporalness. This social function of the solitary subject, the incognito as a prop of the established order and of retrogression, represents nothing that is radically new in the history of irrationalism. Very analogous connections can be verified in Schopenhauer. Kierkegaard's only original contribution was the nuance of individual despair, despair as the elevation and mark of distinction of true individuality. And he raised the pathos of its subjectivity and the nothingness confronting it as its adequate object to a pitch in the face of whose sublimity all petty differences of social life were meant to fade away. Here, too, it is not hard to ascertain where Kierkegaard resembles Schopenhauer and where he differs from him. In both cases, nothingness appears in a mythicizing, mysticized form. But with Schopenhauer, nothingness is the real substance of his Buddhist mythos, whereas its inevitable coming into force refutes and dissolves Kierkegaard's Christian mythos. Kierkegaard thereupon became the pioneer of a reactionary attitude whose repercussions are palpable even today in the philosophies of Heidegger, Camus, and so on. We have referred to nothingness as the adequate object of Kierkegaardian subjectivity, but does not this make us at odds with the facts? Have we not projected into his worldview, unjustifiably, the findings of his later imperialist successors? Was not Kierkegaard a Christian believer, an Orthodox Protestant? If we are to trust Kierkegaard's protestations, and there is no need to discuss the psychological question of how far they were genuine to the last, and how far products of self-deception, etc., he was not only an Orthodox Christian believer, but even at pains to restore the lost purity of Christianity. Our task, however, is to decipher the real, factual substance of these protestations. First and foremost, Christianity was not a doctrine for Kierkegaard. As his own position, to be sure, he countered this negation with the realization in practice, the imitation of Christ. That this imitation was placed emphatically at the center of his thinking does not, it must be admitted, constitute anything startlingly new in the history of religion. But here we must bear in mind the difference that in the earlier forms of emphasizing the imitatio, nothing was set in antithesis to an objective theory, no kind of revealed doctrine whatever. The imitatio was presented as the individual's avenue to bliss, but only if his convictions and deeds agreed exactly with the revealed doctrine. With Kierkegaard, however, this opposition was rendered absolute. For Kierkegaard, Christianity was not a doctrine at all, for that would mean its objective downgrading to a system or part of a system. He wrote, "Objective faith makes it sound as though Christianity were also being proclaimed like a minor system, although not as good as the Hegelian system. Subjectively, the appropriation of such a doctrine, like any relation to objectivity, would be only an approximation, something relative, not the absolute and not God. Thus, once again, theory and praxis, objectivity and subjectivity are presented as mutually exclusive antinomies. Objectively, Kierkegaard wrote, the stress is on what is stated, subjectively on how it is stated, and it is again highly characteristic of the closeness of aesthetics and religion in his system that he added. This distinction already applies in the aesthetic realm, but the stark antithesis had decisive consequences for Kierkegaard's whole view of religion. He took the idea, expressed in the above aphorism, to a detailed conclusion. If there is an objective inquiry after truth, then there is objective reflection upon truth, as an object to which the perceptive mind stands in relation. The reflection is not upon the relation, but upon the fact that it is truth, the true, to which it stands in relation. If that to which the perceiving mind stands related is only the true, then the subject is in truth. If there is a subjective inquiry after truth, there is a subjective reflection upon the relation of the individual. 230. And not omitting to draw all the conclusions that stern from this, he states immediately after the above passage, as long as the how of this relation is in truth, The individual is in truth, even if related thus to untruth. Here it is plain to what degree Kierkegaard was more honest than his imperialist successors. Both reflected upon the subjective act, not upon the object. But whereas Kierkegaard drew from this the only possible inference, namely that no knowledge whatever can be reached by this route, the later existentialists simply removed the parentheses in which, following the method of Husserlian phenomenology, they set the real or imagined objective world while reflecting upon the subjectivity of the act, asseverating that they had then attained to an ontology, a true objectivity. Kierkegaard, on the contrary, stated what was implied in his previous general philosophical studies with great lucidity and in concretely theological terms. One man prays in truth to God, although he is worshipping an idol. The other prays in untruth to the true God, and hence in truth is worshipping an idol. 231. Kierkegaard was therefore in earnest with the theory he directed against Hegel and all objective knowledge. Subjectivity is truth. But what becomes of religion itself and of God in this purported rationale of the existence of religious subjectivity? In his studies pertaining to this, Kierkegaard again took up the approximative character of the apprehension of any objectivity by a subject, and therefore of any knowledge, and demonstrates the untenable position which results from it for the person existing religiously, because he is deemed to need God at the same moment, because every moment in which he does not have God is wasted. 232. And in a footnote to these lines he added, in this way, God certainly becomes a postulate, but not in the casual ordinary sense of the word. Rather, it becomes plain that the only way in which an existing person enters into a relation to God is that the dialectical contradiction casts passion into despair and helps to apprehend God with the category of despair. So the postulate is by no means arbitrary, but a downright self-defense, so that God is not a postulate, but the postulataion of God by the existing being is a necessity. 233. We see how hard Kierkegaard was endeavoring here, nonetheless, to soften his rigorous deductions and to reduce his God's postulate character to a mere, albeit necessary, distinguishing feature of the subjective relation. Such endeavors, however, do not in any way alter the state of affairs inexorably resulting from his premises, and Kierkegaard was far too much a child of his time, far too modern, seriously, to set about changing anything essential to these deductions in the concrete realm, or to attempt, for instance, to demonstrate a real fulfillment of his God postulate. He bore contemporary witness to the dissolution of Hegelianism, was clearly informed of the significance of Feuerbach's critique of religion, and indeed was downright fascinated by his reduction of religion to human subjectivity, although it was Feuerbach's purpose to dissolve religion. Thus he wrote of Feuerbach. On the other hand, a derisive man attacks Christianity, and at the same time expounds it so brilliantly that it is a joy to read him, and anyone who has difficulty in finding a clear-cut account of it is almost obliged to resort to him. 234. This sympathy with the contemporary atheists is no accident. Not only because Kierkegaard grasped clearly, as they did, the untenability of an objective, scientific defense of religion, but also because particular conditions in the ideological reflection of the socio-political crisis of the 1840s brought them very close to each other. We have already stressed more than once how much the disruption of objective idealism formed the center of this crisis, and how much, barring the realization of a dialectical materialist surmounting of Hegel, every bourgeois attempt at the revolutionary surpassing of Hegel was bound to turn into a philosophical subjectivism. This was manifested quite openly in Bruno Bauer or Stirner, but such elements of subjectification are also inherent in the flaws in Feuerbach's anthropologism. Here too, because a dialectical theory of reflection was lacking, the rigorously materialist theory, the object's theoretical independence of the subject, often had to be watered down. Granted, Feuerbach himself was constantly at pains to pursue this materialist line strictly, but he only succeeded in the area of epistemology in the narrower sense. Everywhere else, as Marx, Engels, and Lenin have pointed out, the illogicalities of anthropologism emerge more or less distinctly in Feuerbach's work too. It must therefore be emphasized that the philosophical materialism of Marx and Engels is not identical with Feuerbach's materialism, any more than Marxian dialectics are identical with Hegel's. Through the subjectifying elements, the atheistic consequences of a materialist critique of religion of this type are likewise thrown into vivid relief. Atheism is represented as a new form of religion. This may be observed very clearly with Heine. But even with Feuerbach, such illogicalities arising from the perpetuation of religion in atheistic forms are still present, and Engels, in criticizing these flaws, drew attention to their universal dissemination in this period. He gives as an example the maxim of Louis Blanc's followers, who used to say, "Atheism, therefore, is your religion." 235. With Kierkegaard, of course, there is never any question of an overt allegiance to religious atheism. That was an unconscious, undesired product of his conception. Since Kierkegaard wished to release the defense of religion from Hegel's false idealist objectivism, he was caught up in the subjectivist movement that sought to retract every kind of objectivity into the subject and to have it proceed from the latter exclusively. For that very reason, every object had to vanish in the, as it were, epistemological contemplation of the religious subject. But this methodology was at the same time an exact expression of his spontaneous world sense, thereby determining the typically given surroundings and milieu of his religiously existential relation. It was nothingness. Kierkegaard asked of his religiously existing man that he should retain objective uncertainty, that I am in objective uncertainty upon the 70,000 fathoms of water, and believe nonetheless. 236. But belief in what? Doctrine has disappeared because every doctrine is either a hypothesis or an approximation, because every permanent resolution lies precisely in subjectivity. 237. The community has disappeared because every religious person lives in an absolute incognito, but in absolute passion, which is the ultimate in subjectivity and in the internal path. How of this passion the individual is farthest removed of all from this indirectness. 238. Kierkegaard goes on to state that if two religious persons conversed, the one would have a comic effect on the other, because neither of them would be permitted to express the latent inwardness directly. 239. And what of the imitation of Christ? Since there was no doctrine, since to Kierkegaard's mind, Christ's earthly life itself logically formed the acme of the incognito, how could religious subjectivity know whom to imitate and in what deeds or convictions? Thus it had as a guideline that which it found in its own subjectivity, and with Kierkegaard that was despair and nihilism. And Kierkegaard, obeying his innermost feelings, affirmed this tenuous perfect solitude, this atmosphere of nothingness, precisely from the standpoint of the subjective element's highest development. Not for nothing did he write in his journals, in a sense, a disciple leads a crippled existence as long as his master is also alive. In a certain sense, the disciple cannot achieve the stage of being himself. 204. And the God of Kierkegaard's journals has the same physiognomy of the desperately eccentric bourgeois intellectual. We read in the journals for 1854, God is assuredly a person, but whether he wishes to be so towards the single individual depends on whether that is to God's liking. It is by the grace of God that he wants to be a person in relation to you. If you fritter it away, he will punish you by adopting an objective relation to you. And in that sense, we may say that the world does not have a personal God. 241. And it is wholly in line with this, Kierkegaard's profoundest inner attitude, his solipsistic aristocratism, that he stated just in his last period, when fighting overtly and publicly to restore the purity of Christianity, that there was no Christianity at all in the modern age. Now I have yet to see a single person whose life, according to the impression I gained of it, expressed even remotely that he had expired and had become spirit. So how on earth has it come to pass that entire states and countries are Christian, that we are Christians in our millions? And the protestations of the Christianity of the past would likewise hardly stand up to his criticism were he to choose to apply it. Although the two movements exhibit directly opposing trends, they derive from the same causes, socially speaking. To begin with, the religious conversion which overtook atheism in otherwise progressively minded thinkers only reflects a vacillation and floundering in the face of their own standpoint's ultimate consequences. But with the growing decadence of the bourgeois classes and their ideology, it developed more and more into an abdication of any critical viewpoint in respect of philosophical questions. It is the same process as that of the agnosticism of philosophizing natural scientists, which was an abashed materialism for a time before it turned increasingly into reactionary idealism and myth fabrication in the imperialist age. On the other hand, the conversion to atheism of the religiously disposed attitude was, regarded directly, a spontaneous process of disintegration in the religious outlook. However, the reactionary bourgeoisie's elastic defensive tactics were able to turn it into a new means of defense, in that, with the help of this disintegration, that crisis within the bourgeois intelligentsia, which would have otherwise induced a falling away from all religion, could be arrested and redirected into a religious safeguarding of the established order. So gradually, in the imperialist period, the two trends intertwined and were already often hard to tell apart. We have mentioned the reactionary bourgeoisie's tactics. The accuracy of our statement would suffer, however, were we, for instance, to charge Kierkegaard with such tactics. Subjectively, Kierkegaard was a sincerely convinced thinker, whose contradictions originated in the fact that he was borne along on social currents, whose nature he understood in part not at all, and in part very inadequately. In Kierkegaard, we encounter the mode of feeling, spontaneously expressed, of an intellectual bourgeois stratum which had become deracinated and parasitical. How little this was to do with a personal problem, or with a narrowly Danish one, is evident not only from Kierkegaard's later international influence, but also from the fact that, wholly independently of him, similar versions of religious atheism were starting to spring up and to take effect all around him. Here it is impossible to discuss this question even in outline. I will just refer briefly to Dostoevsky, who under totally different concrete social conditions and with totally different objectives and means, often adopted a thoroughly similar position with regard to the intertwining of religion and atheism. An investigation of the parallels and divergences would be interesting and instructive, certainly. But we must be content with pointing out that with Dostoevsky's holy man, atheism is represented as nothing less than the ultimate step to perfect faith. Admittedly, Dostoevsky, in marked contrast to Kierkegaard, attempted to portray even this most perfect faith in its humanly practical fulfillment. But typically, he always represented it such that, while it was destined to signify an overcoming of the Kierkegaardian incognito of human beings in their mutual relations, it always expressed the close affinity of this clairvoyant goodness with the deepest skepticism towards men and a nihilistic contempt for them. Here in Kierkegaard's case, then, we are dealing with a more advanced form of religious atheism than Schopenhauer's. The contradictions we have just indicated in him may be amplified by comparing them with a fresh aspect, that of their relation to praxis. Schopenhauer's pessimistic irrationalism culminated in a complete ascetic withdrawal from all praxis. Kierkegaard, on the contrary, firmly stressed the role of deeds and action for existing subjectivity. Indeed, he polemicized, and not without reason, against the fanciful element in German idealism's pure contemplation. Quite correctly, he called the identical subject-object propounded by Schelling and Hegel a phantom. This antithesis between Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard was again a result of historical developments, of the mounting crisis in the social being of the bourgeois class. What, in the quagmire of the Restoration period, was the typical form of reactionary withdrawal from participation in social praxis, and thus the typical form for the intelligentsia's reactionary neutralization, and what again became the universally typical form after the defeat of the 1848 revolution, could no longer suffice in the crisis-stricken 1840s. Regarded objectively, Kierkegaard accomplished a reactionary neutralization, a reactionary diversion from social praxis, just Schopenhauer did. But he countered social praxis not with the pure form of contemplative dissociation from life, but with an authentic, existential action, albeit an action which, as we have noted, was just carefully purged of all social determinants, and was thus in reality only a quasi-acting. To be sure, this was endowed with the inner attributes of action, and its conceptual description implied the most diverse active spiritual deeds. It therefore gave the illusion of being a copy of action itself, although everything whereby action really becomes action, namely the objectivity of social life, was extinct in it. It did dawn on Kierkegaard himself, in certain moments of self-criticism, that this central portion of his thinking presents basically a caricature of action. He wrote in his journals, "Can you imagine anything more ridiculous than wanting to use a crane to pick up a pin?" 2:44. It must be said, however, that just this illusory essence, distorted as it was because of pure inwardness, lent to Kierkegaard's philosophy in the crisis of the 1840s, a certain influence which became widespread in the major crisis between the two world wars and still exists today. For, on the one hand, the extinction of the social determinants of praxis made it easier to decide in favor of the established order. And on the other hand, the semblance of praxis bestowed on the intelligentsia's irrationalist neutralization a firmer and more active reactionary accent than we find in Schopenhauerian contemplation. At the time of Kierkegaard's later imperialist influence, this accent underwent a heightening in that modern existentialism, through the help afforded by Husserl's phenomenological method, had at its disposal more subtle means of eradicating the concrete social determinants than Kierkegaard himself possessed. His modern successors eliminated all that was concrete in praxis, concretely historical and social, but retained nonetheless a distorted framework of both in the form of an allegedly ontological objectivity. Thus, unlike Kierkegaard, existentialist praxis no longer placed empty, purposeless, anti-ethical, world-historical doings in antithesis to the purely inward concern for one's own salvation, but sought to give the impression that we may make a free choice and realize our project in true reality purified ontologically in the situation. Existentialism's erasing of the contents, evolutionary direction, etc. of the social determinants enabled Heidegger to exercise his free choice by opting for Hitler. This conception of quasi-activity was the crucial step which Kierkegaard took beyond Schopenhauer in the history of irrationalism. In this respect, Nietzsche subsequently took a further step towards a still firmer, more militant reaction. But for all the contrasts manifest here, we must not neglect the close affinity of Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, particularly in questions of ethics. When he read Schopenhauer in the 1850s, Kierkegaard showed a warm appreciation of his philosophy. With his intellectual acumen, to be sure, he at once pointed out the weakest aspect of Schopenhauer's ethics, that it is always hazardous to propound an ethic when the teacher is not in its power. 245. In another passage, he brusquely dismissed as academic claptrap Schopenhauer's claim to be the first to have allocated asceticism a place in the system. 46. And from this angle, he investigated Schopenhauer's stance towards the academic philosophy, which they both affected to despise. But what is the difference between Schopenhauer and a professor? In the last resort, it is only that Schopenhauer has private means. His conclusion was that in the Socratic sense, which to Kierkegaard meant a great deal as denoting the non-Christian form of existence, Schopenhauer was not wholly innocent of mere sophistry. But how does Kierkegaard himself pass the test in which Schopenhauer was found wanting? First of all, he had to admit that the existential significance of a material independence through private means was as crucial in his own case as in Schopenhauer's. He was honest enough to admit this openly, at least in his journals. My becoming a writer is basically due to my melancholy, to that and my money. 247. And in another passage, but even if I considered my life a writer in total detachment from the rest of my life, there is still a danger, the danger that I have been privileged in respect of my ability to lead an independent life. This I fully recognize, and to that extent I feel very small in comparison to those who have managed to develop a genuine life of the mind in real poverty. 248. So here Kierkegaard had nothing with which to tax Schopenhauer. Both their philosophies culminate in an independent, purely inward attitude away from the bustle of the everyday world of society. From this vantage point, they both looked down with great contempt on the wage-earning philosophers. And it turns out that the basis for this aloofness is not to be sought in their ethic itself, but in the financial independence of its authors. This point is not without historical significance, because in its heyday, bourgeois philosophy produced thinkers who effectively adopted the same attitude to the trade, although without the irrationalistically reactionary premises and deductions, while making many personal sacrifices. It will suffice to mention Spinoza, Diderot, or Lessing. Even more important is the fact that with regard to the existential realization of his ethics, Kierkegaard too came very close to the Schopenhauerian answer, albeit in a more veiled and less cynical form. Let us reconsider the passage where Kierkegaard denies his contemporaries the right to call themselves Christians. Here we find in parentheses the phrase, any more than I believe myself to be one. And in the book's concluding reflections we read, if, on the other hand, nobody in our age will dare to adopt the task and character of the reformer, then let the established order stand and retain validity, just as long as it is ready to subscribe to the truthful admission that, considered in Christian terms, it is only a modified approximation to Christianity. 249. Now what else does this express other than Schopenhauer's attitude to asceticism in theory and in his own praxis? If we substitute Christianity for asceticism in Kierkegaard's commentary on Schopenhauer's position from which we are about to quote, we not only have from Kierkegaard a self-criticism which is unconscious, but all the more devastating on that account. We also find a further agreement for the thesis that the gist of his philosophy was less a regeneration of Christianity than a new variety of irrationalist religious atheism. Kierkegaard wrote, the fact that asceticism now has a place in the system, does that not signify indirectly that its time is over? There was a time when men were ascetic in character. Then there came a time when the whole business of asceticism was consigned to oblivion. Now somebody is boasting of being the first to allocate to it a place in the system. But precisely this kind of preoccupation with asceticism shows that it does not exist for him in the true sense of the word. Schopenhauer, far from actually being a pessimist, represents at most something interesting. In a way, he renders asceticism interesting, which could not be more dangerous for an age bent on pleasure, for this age will suffer the most harm of all by distilling pleasure even out of asceticism. That is to say, contemplating asceticism without having the character for it, and allotting to it a place in the system. 250. This unconscious self-criticism is all the more telling because in the first place, Kierkegaard is confessing, involuntarily again, that Christianity belongs to the past, and that it is precisely his qualitative dialectic treatment, the place of religion in the stages, which provides proof of this. Especially considering that, as we have just demonstrated, the purely ethical, practical, subjective character of religion is a self-deception on Kierkegaard's part, because he, like Hegel or Schopenhauer, only created a system. In the second place, and most importantly, Kierkegaard pointed out with heavy emphasis here how frivolous and inappropriate to crucial ethical questions it was of Schopenhauer to render asceticism interesting, and how far he was pandering to the pleasure-seeking tendencies of a hedonistically decadent world. But exactly the same criticism applies to Kierkegaard. And that is no coincidence, for such demands as Buddhist asceticism or paradoxical Christianity would, if taken literally, be anachronistic absurdities in the capitalist, not to say imperialist, period. Their exponents would be pure eccentrics of no interest to anybody. The reason why Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard achieved a worldwide influence lies in the essential nature of their systems, as analyzed above. It is of the essence of capitalism that every bourgeois ethic is bound to be contradictory in character. Marx rightly said of the ordinary bourgeois, the bourgeois has the same attitude to the institutions of his regime as the Jew to his law. He dodges round them as often as is feasible in every single case, but expects everybody else to abide by them. 251. The bourgeois intelligentsia reflected the same state of affairs, but in greater complexity. When the class was in the ascendant and entertained illusions about its own being that were world historically justified, there arose endeavors to solve the contradictions intellectually on the basis of the bourgeoisie's socio-historical mission in life. The relation between bourgeois and citoyen is one of the key questions in this complex, an honest attempt to comprehend intellectually the objective contradictions of bourgeois life. With the marked emergence of the contradictions in capitalism, with a cessation of the struggle to dissolve the feudal leftovers completely, and the origin of the bourgeoisie's defensive front against the proletariat as its one serious battleground, the period of apologetics naturally commenced in ethics as well. Their vulgar form was a direct sanction of all the hypocrisies that this social evolutionary trend prompted in the average bourgeois. Their indirect forms succeeded in affirming bourgeois society from the moral viewpoint by means of complicated detours. For in very general terms, indirect apologetics were based on repudiating reality as a whole, in such a way that this repudiation's ultimate consequences led to the affirmation of capitalism, or at least to a benevolent tolerance of it. In the ethical realm, indirect apologetics chiefly discredited social action in general, and in particular any tendency to want to change society. They achieved this goal by isolating the individual, and by setting up ethical ideals so lofty and sublime that in the face of them, seemingly petty and fleeting social objectives would fade and disintegrate. But if such ethics are to gain an influence which is real, broad, and profound, they must not only set up this lofty ideal, but also waive the pursuit of it. For to realize such an ideal could confront the decadent bourgeois individual with a task posing as much personal difficulty social action does. And that would render problematic the efficacy of the diversionary function of indirect apologetics. The decadent bourgeois, and in particular the decadent intellectual, requires a morally aristocratic boost that imposes no obligations. To heighten his enjoyment still further, he will want, while possessing de facto all the privileges of bourgeois life, to feel that he is the exception, and even the rebellious, nonconformist exception. This granted, he will reproduce the totally self-absorbed egotism of the ordinary bourgeois in the sphere of pure spirituality, and have at the same time the pleasurable sense of being infinitely superior to the latter and radically opposed to ordinary bourgeois morality. Only through such twofold suppositions and suspensions can indirect apologetics entirely fulfill their social function in the realm of morality, the function of creating a complicated system of modes of conduct remote from practical everyday life and meeting the intelligentsia's spiritual needs and demands. And yet the innermost core of these modes remains, in etherealized, inflated, and distorted way, that basic form of bourgeois social being and the ethic expressing it as defined above by Marx. Indirect apologetics and ethics have the task of steering intellectuals, sometimes rebellious ones, back to the path of the bourgeoisie's reactionary development, while preserving all their intellectual and moral pretensions to a superior ease in this respect. In devising such methods, Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard played pioneering roles. Their epigones did not invent anything fundamentally new. They merely adapted these methods to the imperialist bourgeoisie's increasingly reactionary needs, casting off more and more that residue of consistency, of good faith, which Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard still evinced in part. They increasingly became pure apologists of bourgeois decadence, and nothing else. Notes: see especially F. Kunst der Philosophie Salomo and Maimons, Heidelberg 1991-5510F. Collected Works, Stuttgart 1856F, Section 1, Vol. F. p. 22. Fichte, Works, edition by F. Medicus, Vol. 288. 4 Hegel, Encyclopedia, para. 231. Collected Works, Berlin 183F, Vol. 404. 5 Ibid, Vol. Fang p. 145F. 6 Lenin, from the Posthumous Works, Berlin 49 p. 70. 7 Hegel, Op. Vol. 4th, pp. 150 and 145. 8 quoted from F. Tony Hobbes' Second Imper, Stuttgart, NDP 147. 9 Marx Engels, Collected Works, Section 1, Vol. 64. 10 Marx, Theories on Surplus Value, Vol. 1. The Founding of Irrationalism, 297. 1 Marx Engels, The German Ideology. 1 Engels, The Dialectics of Nature. 1 Engels, Anti-Deering. 1 Hegel, Encyclopedia, para. 7 through Fonts, p. 141. 1 Jacobi's Über die Lehre des Spinoza, Munich, 1912 p. 66, 16 Ibid p. 7 Ott, 1 published Ein, Die Schriften zu Fichtes Atheismusstreit, Munich 191 Pin e Maeve. 1 Hegel, Encyclopedia per 6 Keys Vol 3 4, 19 Jacobi's Über die Lehre des Spinoza, pp. 4, 20 Ibid p. 77. 2 Friedrich Schlegel, Early Prose Works, Vienna 1906, Vol. p. 85, 2 Ibid p. 88. 2 Feuerbach, Collected Works, Leipzig 1846, Vol. 1 p. 289, 2 Ibid, p. 245, fu 2285. 2 Vico, The New Science. 2 Ibid. 29 Engels, Andy Deering, 3 Ibid 3 Schelling, Op. Cit, Part 1, Vol. 1 LL, p. 628. 3 Marx, Mega, Part 1, Vol. 1 2, p. 316. This ambiguous dual tendency is already to be found in Boehme himself, cp. Marx Engels, Early Philosophical Works, Berlin 1953, p. 258. 3 4 Translator's Note. Heinz Weiderporst's Epicurean Confession, written in 1799 in opposition to Novalis. 3 5 Kant, Critique of Judgment, para. 7 7, translated by J. C. Meredith, OU 36 Ebid, 30 B. Id, para. 7 5. 3 8 Goethe's Essay and Schauen der Urteilskraft, 3 9 Schelling, Part 1, Vol. 1L, pp. 89F. 40 Spinoza, Ethics, Part 1, 7th Statement. 4 1G. Lukacs, The Young Hegel, translated by Rodney Livingstone, London 1975. 42 Schelling, Up Sit, Part 1, Vol. 1 V, p. 361. 4 3 Ibid, 44 Ibid, p. 362. 4 5 Ibid, Part 1, Vol. L, p. 369. 4 6 Ibid, Part 1, Book with p. 269. 4 7 Ibid. 98. 48 Ibid, p. 267. 9 Ibid. The Destruction of Reason. 50 from J. E. Erdmann, Versuch einer wissenschaftlichen Darstellung der Geschichte der neueren Philosophie, Stuttgart 1831, Part 1, Vol. 1 I, p. 290 F, and 304. 5 Schelling, Up Sit, Part Vol. Fa, p. 9. 5 2 Ibid, p. 261 Fichte, O. P. Sitte, Vol. 1, p. 747. 54 Schelling, Op. Sitte, Part Vol. 1 I, 6 Tough 5, 56 6 620 Fem, 5 7